Well, welcome back. My name's Todd Flora. I'm the publisher of Westside Voice, and I'm here today with Santa Monica City Council candidate Jesse Zwick,
Hey Todd,
who,
thank you for having me.
yes, who is a public policy um, expert. No, what did you? I'd already screwed this up.
Advisor,
He's a
either
public
one.
policy advisor and a candidate, but important for today's purposes, he's a candidate for Santa Monica City Council. And I want to thank you for joining me today, Jesse. And let's get right into it. And I'll leave you talking about kind of yourself and the campaign a little bit for the end. But let's jump right into housing. What is your stance on new housing construction and these new RENA numbers that are very high?
Well, I think if you talk to any, leader of the Democratic Party, progressive, liberal, centrist, they'll all tell you that we have a major housing crisis, and it's particularly bad in California. And I think that, many municipalities throughout the entire state have failed to do the work of planning and siting new housing for 40 years. And now we see ourselves with an enormous deficit that's creating an enormous affordability crisis throughout Santa Monica and all of Southern California. So the state is trying to say to each municipality, you have to pull your weight. You have to add add housing to keep up with the amount of job growth and population growth that we've seen in our state. And I think it's up to municipalities to figure out the best ways to accommodate that growth. I think that there's a fantasy that some have that we can push back against Sacramento and essentially say, no thanks. But the honest truth is we have two options. One is that Sacramento forces this down our throats in whatever way they want. And the other is that we come together as a community and make a plan for how best to build this housing, where it should go, what it should look like, and how it best serves us. And that's what I want to do.
Okay, so would you consider yourself an abundant housing advocate?
I think there are three things that really policymakers have identified as sort of being the foundation of a healthy city that protects and keeps people in homes and keeps renters in their units. And the first is a series of tenant protections, things like rent control, things like eviction defense, anti-harassment ordinances, all the things that protect tenants and help keep them in their units and protect them from harassment or eviction or other things like that. The second pillar of this, or leg of this stool, so to speak, would be subsidies. Subsidies for deed restricted affordable housing, emergency rental subsidies for renters who can't make their rent 1 month due to a hardship, a job loss, a medical issue, what have you. Subsidies for people who cannot afford to pay market rate rents. And the third leg of that stool, yes, is a measure of abundant housing so that when you want to move, you aren't trapped somewhere. You can actually, if you meet someone and want to start a family, there's an option for you to move to that bigger unit and be able to afford it. So that, when you get a job in the other side of town and you need to leave your rent controlled unit and find another one, that those market rate units haven't been shooting up by 10 and 20 and 30% every year. Because the majority of people, including the majority of low income people, live in market rate units. And we need to worry about them not having runaway costs as well. And the way you get there is by not having major shortages.
Okay, very good. And what is your view on, well, actually, let's skip to this since you talked about renters now. I've seen it on your website that you talked about the importance of renter protections. Can you elaborate on your priorities within that space for renters?
Sure, definitely. I mean, when I did work in the city of Los Angeles, I was working I first worked on her campaign and then I worked on her staff for Council Member Nithya Raman. We put forward a number of measures. Specifically, we put forward a number of measures around strengthening the tenant anti-harassment protection ordinance in Los Angeles, which in many ways was modeled on the anti-harassment ordinance that Santa Monica had already passed. It's a very good, strong standard here. I think there are a number of things that we can do further. While I was working with Nithya Raman, we talked a lot about how we needed to expand and build upon a rental registry that encompassed every single rental unit in the city of Los Angeles, but I think it applies equally to the city of Santa Monica, not just rent stabilized units, but every single rental unit should be registered. And that's the only way we can really start to pull great data, know when eviction proceedings are being held, inform renters of their rights and the maximum allowable rents. We need a really strong rental registry in order for governments to keep track of and make sure that we're keeping landlords honest and following the rules and regulations. I think beyond that, Santa Monica has a right to counsel program, but it's not universal. It doesn't apply to everyone. We don't have enough funding for it at this moment. that you just immediately have the right to a council if you're facing eviction. We need to work on expanding that so that it goes from being a pilot program to being a real right that every renter has when being faced in that situation. We
Okay.
see that when a renter is facing eviction, if they are unrepresented by a lawyer, there's almost a 90% chance that they will end up being evicted from that unit. When they get a lawyer on their side, that goes on all the way down to 9%, just to have someone who knows the process and helps them through it. So I think those are a few of the things I want to look at. Obviously,
Very
rent
good.
control itself has been a really big issue in Santa Monica. There have been proposals on the city council to alter the fundamental nature of what rent control is in Santa Monica.
Right.
And people who want to no longer make that a blanket protection of all units that were built between 1995 and all people who live in them. And I think that's a really terrible way to go. I think rent control is a bedrock of protecting renters. And I think renters deserve it for all sorts of reasons, but mainly because they deserve the same amount of stability that homeowners have in knowing that every year they're not going to see their rent rise 20 or 30% and have to suddenly move away, take their kid out of school, suddenly live far from their job. These are basic human rights that I think all renters should enjoy.
Okay, very good. And do you have an overall philosophy or feeling about commercial development?
Well, in general, I think one of the big problems in Santa Monica is we really overinvested in commercial real estate and underinvested in housing. So we have a huge jobs, homes imbalance here. We added 5 jobs for every 1 home in Santa Monica for the last 40 years. And as a result, we got to a situation now where our nighttime population is approximately 90,000. Our daytime population is over 200,000. And what that represents is over 90% of our workforce not being able to afford to live here, driving 2 to 4 hours into the city and out of the city each day. It's over 80,000 people who work in Santa Monica who can't afford to live here. And it's a major issue both for those people and having their quality of their lives and their commutes, not being people who serve our community who aren't able to send their kids to school in our community. And it's also a major ecological issue. Transportation is the #1 sector of climate emissions in the state of California. It represents over 40% of our total emissions. And while we're doing a good job changing our energy mix and reducing greenhouse gases in every other way, we're seeing the climate emissions actually rise year over year because people keep having to drive further and further away to find a place where they can qualify to live. And then they have to drive into job centers to work. And that's a huge issue.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, very good. Um, so let's talk about tourism and the downtown. How do we get that part of town going again?
I mean, I think there was a real 1-2 punch over the last few years, and part of it obviously was the pandemic, this huge exogenous shock that no one could have prepared for. But it happened also at the exact same time as even online retail taking off in this way as well, where you saw a lot of the prominent retail stores along the promenade and other places really just lose their tenants because of that combination of the loss of tourism and the shift to online retail. And I think we're going to have to really reimagine these spaces, bring in new tenants, think about other types of businesses that are less vulnerable to the vicissitudes of the way that the economy are shifting, and everything is moving online, and Amazon is gobbling up an increasing number of those retail businesses.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of opportunities though, and I also think it's another opportunity also to look at our commercial corridors and say, well, how could we repurpose some of this perhaps for housing since we have this imbalance? Or how could we add housing above our commercial corridors in a way that doesn't displace anyone who's currently living here, but actually adds customers and adds foot traffic for our local businesses by putting them literally right above our stores?
Yeah, I saw that on your website, the building on top of commercial. Okay, so maybe repurposing some things, but you still have it in mind to keep the downtown and the tourism economy vibrant.
Definitely. Santa Monica is a tourist economy. We make a lot of our revenue from our hotel taxes and other such sales taxes, and a lot of that is powered by tourism. We have an international brand and reputation. And I think some of it is going to come back on its own as hopefully the world continues to recover from this global shock. But some of it's going to also have to do with how we manage our crises around housing and homelessness, because there's definitely people in the business community who I've talked to who have had experiences where their customers or their hotel guests have felt unsafe or otherwise unhappy about the situation on the ground in Santa Monica, and we really need to be investing in housing and services to move people more quickly off the streets, and the kind of long-term planning that I'm talking about to address our housing crisis to actually stem the inflow of people into homelessness as well.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about homelessness next. So the city of Los Angeles has a controversial ordinance, 4118. It essentially tells the initial iteration basically said people can't camp in public throughways, sidewalks and such. They've expanded it recently to include any space 500 feet from a school or daycare center. Do you think to battle homelessness, Santa Monica needs something like Ordinance 4118?
Well, Santa Monica already has something like Ordinance 4118. They don't allow camping in Santa Monica as it is. And the difference between Santa Monica and LA is that that ordinance has not traditionally been challenged in the courts like the one in Los Angeles has. In part because Santa Monica is a smaller city, but also in large part because Santa Monica has traditionally maintained an acceptable level of shelter beds available to people. And the basis of the challenge to that ordinance in Los Angeles has always been that courts have said you cannot outlaw sitting, lying, and sleeping in public areas if you do not have an adequate number of shelter beds to offer people in that place. And while Santa Monica has actually managed to maintain an acceptable ratio of unhoused people to shelter beds, Los Angeles hasn't been able to. So I think we're very lucky here in Santa Monica to be able to not be really ensnared in this debate over sitting, lying, and sleeping in public space, because Los Angeles has become so polarized around it that I worry at times that, look, I don't believe that outlawing someone from sitting or lying or sleeping on the street is going to suddenly make them not homeless. I think it's a short-sighted policy. But I also think that spending all of our time debating over where someone can sit or where they can sleep in terms of different public places is missing the forest for the trees, when what we really need to be doing is figuring out how we can get people into homes.
Yeah, okay, very good. Well, you've certainly thought these things out. What's
Well,
your
I've been in the thick of it for a few
yeah,
years here.
yeah. What is your overall philosophy on public safety? And do you have any particular feelings on the size of Santa Monica Police Department? Do you think we need more officers?
Public safety is a real concern. I think it gets mixed up in homelessness a lot. Sometimes there are real safety concerns and real upticks in crime that we really need to address. Sometimes people see someone who's unhoused or otherwise down on their luck and they associate that disorder with crime. And I think both are happening. There's no question we saw an uptick in crime across Southern California, and in fact, across the nation in certain categories during the last few years of the pandemic. It's been a really difficult time, and we need to make sure that our public safety agencies are equipped to best handle it. Santa Monica, I think, has around 220, I would say, sworn police officers. It doesn't have all those positions filled right now. Like a lot of departments, they, because of budget cuts and because of hiring issues, they haven't been able to even fill to their authorized number of positions. I think a good place to start is to at least get them up to that authorized number of 220. And I think that, I would work to make sure that we can have enough funding to be able to make sure that happens.
Okay, all right, fair
And
enough.
when I look
Oh, yes,
more
go ahead.
broadly at the issue, I think police have been tasked. I think what is their core competency? It's to respond to violence, to protect people from violence, and to solve crimes. And I think that needs to be what we're really allowing people to focus on. The problem in Los Angeles and Santa Monica and the region is that we've also tasked police with solving basically every other social problem that we have on our streets: homelessness, mental illness, so many things. And I really think what we need to be doing is building up a separate parallel capacity to really deal with those issues, respond to those crises, and enable police to have the time and resources to really do their core competencies well, which is keep us safe and solve crimes. So I think there's a real issue where we have to build capacity and allow police the time and resources to do their jobs well, and not task them with solving every single social ill, which sometimes they're best equipped for, and sometimes another type of agency or service would be better equipped for.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that, for expanding on that a bit. Oh, I had this one next to the rent control question originally, and I jumped ahead for that one. So back to rent control for just a second. Excuse me. Are you supporting the rent control board's requested measures on the ballot this fall?
Yeah, there was a long and tortured process. I don't think, the exact request ended up getting on the ballot, but there was a version of it that went through council and is on the ballot. And the core element to it was to lower the cap of acceptable rent increases from a limit of 6% down to 3%. We'd never really seen higher than 3% rent increases for our rent control units until this year, because we hadn't seen inflation at the degree to which it is this year since rent control was enacted. But now that we're seeing it, yes, it's a huge problem. And, renters who have already, low income renters or elderly renters on fixed incomes who have already had a really tough year keeping up with the soaring prices of gas and food and everything else. It's too much for them to sustain a 6% rent increase. And I definitely support lowering the cap to 3%.
Okay, very good. And what about the dueling tax measures on the ballot? Are you supporting either, both, neither, one or the other?
Well, it's a complicated issue as well. I signed the measure that was the citizen initiative supported by the mayor to add a transfer tax that would raise money for schools and affordable housing. I have now seen also that the council led by Councilmember Phil Brock have added a competing measure, and there's only one. The nature of them is that they both can't exist. Only one can. So whichever gets the most votes will be the law. I saw recently that Councilmember Gleam Davis came out in support of the alternative measure. She's someone who I respect and admire. So I think I need to talk with her and make sure I fully understand both measures and which would best serve the community before I weigh in publicly.
Oh, okay. Okay, fair enough. Now, let's talk a little bit more about you, and more specifically, how are you going to win? What are your keys to pulling this off? Have you raised, or do you see a path to the amount of money you'll need? And are there any key endorsements you're counting on?
Yeah, sure. I've kind of cut my teeth running political campaigns and doing communications for them and other races. So I feel like I have a sense of how to run a modern campaign. I think traditionally campaigning in Santa Monica has been a little bit relaxed. There are certain institutions that have enjoyed a lot of traditional support, groups like Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights and otherwise. And if you got their endorsement, you pretty much were guaranteed a seat on the council. In 2020, we saw that didn't happen. We saw a lot of SMER endorsed candidates lose to some, other kind of outsider candidates, most of whose politics I don't share, but who employed grassroots tactics and were able to force their way onto council. And I think it speaks to the need for people of all political persuasions to run more robust campaigns that aren't just, hiring a consultant, sending out a mailer and thinking that's good enough. And what I've been doing and focusing on really hard is fundraising and building a real base of volunteers. I've raised close to $40,000, and I have upwards of 60 to 70 signed up volunteers that are ready to start knocking on doors for me. So what I plan to do is run a really robust campaign starting in September, where we use our volunteer power to talk to as many people as possible, and we use the money we've raised to put out a lot of communications to get our name and our message out. I've secured the endorsement of Councilmember Gleam Davis. I've secured the endorsement of LA County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, and about 30 other, distinguished community members that I'm really proud to have on my side. I just learned the other day that I secured the endorsement of Santa Monica Forward, which is also a big progressive group in the city that I'm very excited will be supporting me. And I'm going through the endorsement process with every other group this week, basically. So I hope to win more support. But I think when September rolls around, with the absence of SMER and the Dems, we'll be through that process. And the real fight after that will be going straight to voters. And I think that's how it should be. It should be about talking to voters. And I plan to try to bring in as many people into the process who maybe don't ever consider their local race or why it might matter to them and why they should get engaged. And my plan is to talk to them and show them that they can, that they should.
Okay. And so you are seeking the SMER and Democratic Club endorsements?
Oh, I'm seeking both for sure.
Okay.
I've asked formally, and I'm filling out the endorsement questionnaires, and those processes will continue after Labor Day.
Very, very good. And what about law enforcement, police and fire? Are you seeking any of those endorsements?
Yeah, I sat down with police and fire this morning, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Okay. So the last question is really open-ended. It's anything that you wanted to get to, but I didn't get to. Think of this as like your closing argument to anybody watching. What would you like to say as we close out our time together?
I think that the city council in Santa Monica is interesting. Unlike in Los Angeles and certain other places, it's a part-time job. If anything, it's a a part-time job with a lot of hours and very little pay.
Yeah,
And
I was
it's
going to
such
say, don't kid yourself.
yeah,
Here in Santa
it's
Monica in particular.
exactly. And I think that, traditionally that sets up a lot of barriers for people, especially people in the middle of their life who might have other full-time jobs, who might have kids, young kids, both of which is my situation, which definitely makes it difficult from a representation standpoint, but I think it's really, really vital to have a council that represents a diversity of views, viewpoints, ages, and things like that. And particularly, I think to have young parents who are looking now at Santa Monica and who aren't just thinking like some perhaps older members of the community, how do I make Santa Monica 1950 again? But instead are looking at Santa Monica and looking at their kids and saying, how am I going to have housing that my kids are going to afford? How are we going to have a climate that my kids can live in? How are we going to make Santa Monica the best it can possibly be by 2050? And I really think we have a dearth of those voices right now. And that's the kind of council member I want to be. I want to be a council member for the next generation of Santa Monicans.
Very good, very good. And I understand you're off to get married this week.
I am. Pandemic threw a lot of plans in the loop. We had a kid, and now we're going off to get married when we can finally gather with at least a few family members. And it's a lot to plan a wedding amidst running a campaign and doing everything else. But we're limping to the finish line and looking forward to actually tying the knot.
Well, congratulations and have a great time with it, and come back and work your butt off for 2 months. Jesse Zwick, Public Policy Advisor, candidate for Santa Monica City Council. Thank you so much for talking to me in Westside Voice.
Thank you, Todd. It was great.
I really appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thank you.